Thanks to Docomomo for the invitation, and thanks to everybody for coming along. I really appreciate it. Tonight, I suppose I'm going to talk about a longer history of Cruickshank Seward. I'll start with a slide that's got really small writing on it. I promise you all the others are just pictures. This is for my benefit more than anyone else. So Herbert William Cruickshank and Henry Thomas Seward met one another in World War One. And Seward was from Bournemouth and Cruickshank was from Aberdeen. And so it goes, they set up practice in Manchester because it was midway between those two places. On this slide, the text, which is from my doctorate, sort of speculates about their interwar work and the sorts of successes that they had. Because at the time, there was very little work published, and it was very difficult to find out exactly what they'd done. Subsequently, so I finished my PhD in 2018. Subsequently, new digital information is coming to light all the time. And so that means that new buildings are revealed, new images of buildings come to the surface. And so what's really interesting is that all of the builder has been scanned by the Internet Archive, and so you can search that, and it's OCR, so it's text-based. So rather than going to the RIBA library where they sort of catalogue individual articles or things that are substantial, at the back of the builder they used to list almost every job that was going on and its contract value and who the architect was. But that's something that would never make it into a normal kind of indexing system in a library. So just by searching that, that's yielding sort of new information. And similarly, old archival photographic collections are being scanned and digitised and put online. And this is one example. So this little Volvo garage on Sackville Street from 1932. I've been looking for an image of this for about a decade, and then the town hall in Manchester emptied itself out for a refurbishment, and the photographer's archive was discovered. The photographer had long since ceased to be a role in the city council, but all of his photos were left in a room. And the archives, Central Archives at Manchester, set about indiscriminately scanning these. So there's amazing, 36 films of collapsed sewer in Cheadle, for example. But amongst them was this image of this Volvo distributors. And the reason that it was important to me was because I had a hunch that it might be white and it might be made of faience, because into the sort of early 1930s, this started to be a bit of a motif of the firm, and the use of white was something that prevailed after the war as well. And Cruickshank Seward are unusual in many respects, that they had a successful period on both sides of World War II. I mean, lots of kind of histories of post-war architects are about these bright young things, or the young Turks, as Nicholas Bullock refers to them, sort of changing the world and embracing modernism wholeheartedly through the 50s and 60s. But Cruickshank Seward, as I say, are one of these few firms that had a success on both sides of that. But they weren't practicing overtly kind of modern architecture in the interwar period. It was this very polite form of neoclassicism, seen here at Edgehill College, which is now a university near Ormskirk in West Lancashire, and here in Southport Technical College. And lots of these jobs they won in competition. And again, one of these things that I've only found out recently, searching on Internet Archive with OCR, is that Cruickshank actually died on the 16th of October, the day before this college was opened. And this is an image from the opening brochure. But as I said, they began to sort of make some of these white faience and white tiled buildings. And this is a very pared back wallpaper shop on Peter Street for John Lyne and Sons from 1938. And the Ritz Ballroom, also from 1938, similarly in white faience. Now again, these are sort of very pared back, kind of classical architecture, typical of the period. But there were hints of modernity that started to arrive. And again, I knew about the gas showroom previously because that was published in architectural journals and was searchable via the RIBA library. But the cinema in Congleton, which is 10 years earlier, only came to light through one of these recent searches. And obviously you can see there's a kind of familial similarity between these two buildings. And again here, this sort of, nudging into something that is contemporary in Furswood Library, which is in a suburb of Manchester. So this relatively successful, but not necessarily avant-garde practice through the 1920s and 1930s. And then into the war period, some work did continue because obviously factories carried on, certain factories carried on production. So this is a canteen for a mill in Oldham that they completed. And then immediately after the war, converting ARP shelters into day nurseries, again for a spinning company in Oldham. Library, again, one of these ones that's been recently recovered. I've not yet asked Stockport to remove the watermark, apologies. But these quite traditional styles still prevailing. And then this is an extension to Ferranti, who were an electrical engineering manufacturers in Hollingwood, which is south of Oldham, north of Manchester, from 1950. Now, Ferranti were important regionally. They were the company that helped to manufacture the world's first commercial computer, the Pegasus. But they were also important to Cruickshank Seward because they were one of the clients to which they returned. And just in front of this building in 1968 were these drawing offices made for Ferranti and designed by John Seward. And John Seward was the son of H.T. Seward. H.T. really admired another practice in Manchester called Fairhurst. And he admired Fairhurst for their kind of dynastic qualities. And he was very keen for his son to become involved in the practice and for the practice to sort of take on a similar sort of stature. They also produced buildings for other people. So some work here for the National Dock Labour Board, both in Manchester and in Liverpool. They made buildings, but with executive architects for the board, so they were the delivery architects. So as well as John Seward in the post-war period, this chap here, William Arthur Gibbon, was appointed and eventually became a partner in the firm. Now, Gibbon, whose son and daughter are here, hi Nick, hi Kate, thanks for coming along, was a bit of a superstar. He won all sorts of prizes at university. He travelled widely and wrote about architecture as well as becoming an architectural designer. And through his career, he had two really important sponsors, Bertram Vivian Bowden and Charles Reynolds. And here we can see two of Gibbon's earliest buildings, a factory for Ferranti at Wythenshawe, which was producing the gyroscopes for missile guidance systems. And Bowden at the time was working for Ferranti, and I think, although I haven't got any evidence, that Bowden and Gibbon met at this particular point, and their relationship continued, and eventually Bowden was a close family friend. So Charles Reynolds commissioned Gibbon to design Reynolds House for the Reynolds Chain Company, a huge employer in the Manchester district. And Sir Charles Reynolds was a really important regional industrialist. And I'll come back to Reynolds and Bowden. And then this is a power station in Padiham, also by Gibbon from 1957. But there were two other power stations designed by Cruickshank and Seward, one in Mexico and another in Argentina, which I don't think they ever went on a site visit to. I think the drawings were exported and Mexified. So the post-war period saw a new success for Cruickshank and Seward, and Arthur Gibbon was heavily involved in the development of a campus, university campus, that came to be known as UMIST, but began its life as Manchester College of Technology, which can trace its origins back to the Mechanics Institute of Manchester. The campus itself, seen here in the centre of this image, grew outside of the university expansion that took place in the rest of Britain. This was in advance of it. This was happening in the 1950s. And the only other university development of a similar scale that's concomitant is Imperial College in London. And both Imperial and UMIST were designed by necessity. Excuse me. To provide technical and technological education to service the Cold War rearmament programme. Now, one of the remarkable things about the UMIST campus is the area from which it was carved. This is a sloping site down to the River Medlock. The River Medlock itself winding its way through the site. The site is traversed by a Victorian railway viaduct, which itself has the river passing beneath. The original College of Technology can be seen in the top of this image. And this is one of the oldest parts of the city. It was heavily polluted. There was lots of dye works and photo works. So it's a kind of incredibly difficult site that this group of architects came to deal with. And I say a group of architects because originally Sir Hubert Worthington, who was son of eminent Victorian architect Thomas Worthington, was the site architect. And this was a mantle he sort of adopted because he'd been retained as the site architect by the University of Manchester, who underwrote the degrees of UMIST, which was a separate institution. So these are my drawings from Hubert Worthington's archival drawings. And you can see here very early schemes that take on this kind of Beaux-Arts planning that's axial and symmetrical. And steadily that began to change. So the thing that's not orthogonal in that plan is a mill, a 19th century mill called Jackson's Mill, that was retained because the college needed chemical engineering department really quickly. And the quickest way of achieving that was to adapt an existing building. And so as the plans develop, you start to see buildings that were handed over by different people and the plan becoming kind of increasingly sophisticated. And you'll see at the top there that the college has been extended, the original college, to the north of the viaduct. And that's this building here. Now, the extension was by a Blackburn firm called Bradshaw, Gas and Hope, Bolton, and was built between 1927 and 1957, so 30 years to realise. And you can see it to the right of this image, and obviously paying homage to the Spalding and Cross building from 1902 that it was attached to, but very much not a modern building, and certainly not the sort of building you'd expect to see completed in 1957. This was the site of UMIST as surveyed by the City Surveyor and Engineers Department, and you can see the anticipated lifespan of the buildings here, ranging from nil, i.e. ready to fall down, through to 80 years. But most of the buildings here were given a maximum of 20 years to survive. And as I say, you can see sort of dye works and photo works. So the scheme was really developed by committee. So originally H.T. Seward and Arthur Gibbon would attend the committee meetings along with Harry Fairhurst and Worthington himself. And really these were perhaps 3 or 4 of the most important architectural figures in Manchester at that time. And so for them to come together and discuss things and arrive at decisions by consensus was really quite symbolic and important to the culture of architecture in the city at the time, but also perhaps one of the reasons why they made this really successful group of buildings from this very, very difficult site. This is a chap called Tom Warburton, who was a model maker, and you can see just on the bottom left there the kind of old section of the model that's been removed to insert the newer piece there that's in the foreground on the right-hand side. The first 2 buildings that came forward were Staff House, which is on the left here, and the Reynolds Building on the right. Staff House was by Worthington and was an extension to Jackson's Mill. And what it did was it kind of squared off this first sunken courtyard to form one of the quads in UMIST. And the Reynolds Building of 1962 actually features in the 20th Century Society 100 Years, 100 Buildings as the building of 1962. It was the first building of its type in the UK, perhaps in Europe. It was known as a lecture room block. So the podium had 2 large lecture theatres, and then the tower was a series of seminar rooms with smaller lecture theatres stacked up at the back, with acoustic engineering by Holt Bagenal. And one of the reasons for the zigzag facade there was to do with the reflection of the sound back to the speaker. And here's some images just as it was completed. It's not quite finished. You can see on the roof of the podium the zigzag pattern starting to be laid out there. And the staircase here was deliberately transparent and was a little bit of a motif. Arthur worked with an assistant, a guy called Gordon Hodkinson, and Gordon was particularly skilled at these very light-framed staircases, and they began in the Reynolds House that you saw earlier in the 50s, developed through the Reynolds Building here, and also continued into the Roscoe Building at the University of Manchester, which I'll show you shortly. Gibbon and his team knew that were the lecture theatres all to empty out at once, then there wouldn't be enough space in the lifts for all the students to move. So by making this beautiful glazed stair tower, it gave students a view of the Peak District and hopefully encouraged them to use it. So you've got this podium and tower configuration, which again, this is one of the earliest in the country, obviously after SOM's Lever Building in New York. And this absolutely beautiful coming together of that podium and tower. So you've got these pre-stressed, post-tensioned bird's mouth beams that open for the clear story glazing within the sort of foyer area of the podium block. And this is looking out to a building by Fairhurst, the Paris building for civil engineering. In the basement, or the lower ground floor, so the Reynolds Building sort of really successfully straddles this shift in topography from the viaduct down to the river level. And in the lower ground floor here is a painting by Victor Passmore, Metamorphosis, from 1968. And this came about 6 years after the building was opened, largely because the student body were sort of protesting about a lack of culture in their science-based institution. And so some money was found, and Passmore was commissioned to produce this mural. He actually painted it on site with the help of a couple of janitors that he told them what to paint and how to paint, but most of the finer details were done by Passmore himself. So the buildings came forward one at a time. So Hubert Worthington died in 1963, at which point Arthur Gibbon became really the master planner of the site in its entirety. And here is a view from that staircase in the Reynolds building looking back to Chandos Hall of Residence, which again was one of the earliest halls of residences in the UK. And the building committee went on trips to Europe to look at other similar building types in Scandinavia. And again, you can see here the diamond pattern on the roof of the podium as completed. Roofs were really important to Arthur Gibbon. He viewed them as that fifth elevation. And obviously, if you go back to here, you can see this beautiful sweeping curve on the plant room on the roof here. Arthur instructed Gordon to set that out freehand on his drawing board, which Gordon duly did, and then turned it into a series of setting out curves for the contractor. And then across the way is the Barnes-Wallis building of 1966 with another hall of residence, the Wright Robinson Hall, tacked onto the back. So both Arthur Gibbon and John Seward were fans, acolytes of Corbusier, of Alto, and you can see definitely kind of Corbusian or late Corbusian influences in the way that the concrete forms are composed here. This interior had some wonderful 10 Segretti lights by an artist called Michael Yeomans, which unfortunately no longer survive. And I must like that photo of Barnes-Wallis so much, it's in this slide twice. The stair here you can see curving down is known as the Hubert Worthington stair, and it has his name inscribed in the bronze handrail at the top, and we think was already part of the scheme before he died, but the actual design of it fell into the hands of Cruickshank and Seward to make this kind of beautiful cantilevered curve. 1968, also on the same site, the Maths and Social Science building, and then a building supported by Ferranti and named after Ferranti. These are all still standing at the moment, but are not likely to survive for very much longer. They've all been issued with a certificate of immunity, and the site is being developed as we speak. The only building that's not had a decision made on it yet is the Reynolds building, which we're desperately hoping will be listed. But this image here, I think, really tells the story of what Cruickshank and Seward and Arthur Gibbon particularly were trying to do here. Peter Sainsbury, as I'm sure many of you know, was an architect and perspective artist who painted for all sorts of people during the post-war period. In fact, he was so prolific, the room at the Royal Academy Summer Show was referred to as the Sainsbury Room at some point in the late 1960s. But really what you can see here is this bright white, really capturing this sort of sense of white heat, albeit this was in advance of Harold Wilson's speech, set against these two Victorian towers in the background, so the Refuge Assurance on the left and London Road Fire Station on the right, itself then behind that two towers at Piccadilly and Rodwell House. So you've got this sense of really the future city and the sat prominent and proud against the Victorian city behind it. And so these white buildings, if you can imagine, in the mid-1950s, so Manchester was the first to enact actually a clean air policy in 1954 before the Clean Air Act was announced nationally. So to construct white buildings in a soot-blackened city really made you stand out as a young architect. And as I say, has this kind of familial quality to the work that preceded it in the 1920s and 1930s. And another sort of really powerful image here. Lots of these photographs were taken by Sam Lambert. The majority of them now reside in the special collections at Manchester Metropolitan University, who've taken the Cruickshank and Seward archive, or what was left of it once they were bought out. So it's all safe, and there's more work to be done on the practice from that collection. So UMIST wanted to expand, and this is one of the great unbuilt schemes, student village from about 1965. And I think here you can see much more Arthur's kind of influence from Niemeyer and Nervi. He was a huge fan and went to visit Nervi in Rome in the 1950s. And I guess there's a sort of hint of Brasilia coming through here as well. These sort of sunken gardens, these curves, these sort of powerful point blocks. But this really was one of the things that created the master plan for the university that was to come. So as UMIST wanted to expand southward, the University of Manchester wanted to expand northward. This particular site was a site that they both wanted to expand into. And so shortly after this, the local authority intervened and commissioned a higher education precinct master plan and got Hugh Wilson and Lewis Womersley to come together to deliver that. And so the practice Wilson-Womersley emerged from this university commission that was created by this sort of pincer movement on this one particular site in Manchester. I think it's a great shame that this never happened. UMIST did develop this site, and Cruickshank and Seward were responsible for the buildings that came forward, but it was never as exciting as this might have been. As I said, they also did work for the University of Manchester, a separate institution to UMIST. This is the Roscoe building, again with a really fine staircase, wonderful foyer with these V-shaped columns, which again, unfortunately, are now variously encased and made invisible by the enclosure of staircases to make provision for fire safety. So really quite dramatically changed. They also designed the Arts building for the University of Manchester, which I think is part of this family of white, modern, post-war concrete buildings. And then perhaps their finest university building is the only one that has achieved any sort of protected status. This is the Ashby building in Belfast, where I think lots of the things that they'd learned at UMIST, particularly how to handle concrete. They used a product called Snowcrete, which was a white concrete product from Portland cement. And really, I think this is exemplary of all of the best bits of UMIST coming together in a single building. This has recently been restored as well, very, very sensitively, and as I say, is listed in Northern Ireland. I'll be going there in June to revisit. Another really important building by Cruickshank and Seward is the National Computing Centre. It was announced as one of the first projects of Tony Benn's Ministry of Technology that was created after Harold Wilson got into power. And unfortunately, it had quite a sad beginning, which is this quite austere grey box designed by UK Atomic Energy Authority architects, Risley, a chap called Brocklesby, because they had a computer and they needed a building for a computer quickly. And so this was what was erected. You can see UMIST buildings in the background, the aerial motorway, Mancunian Way, flanking it. However, a national computing centre needed to be a bit bigger. And so this slightly shadowed but big black thing you can see on the right of the image was proposed. Again, not sure by whom. It could have been Brocklesby. It certainly wasn't Cruickshank and Seward at this point. Next to, again, a proposed scheme for the BBC North by BDP. And this is a perspective image of that scheme, which also never came to fruition, but I think belongs to BDP's family of buildings, including the Bank of England in Leeds from 1971. Now, if you look at the the cantilever there of the upper floor, I think that was intended to be a soffit. So this is an extract from Wilson and Womersley's education precinct plan of 1965, and the yellow there was intended to be upper level pedestrian areas. And this went all the way back for about a mile up Oxford Road. So at one point it was intended that you would be able to walk upwards to the first floor, very much in the spirit of kind of Buchanan and the things that he'd proposed in Traffic in Towns in '63. But you'd be able to walk about a mile down Oxford Road above the road itself. And again, not dissimilar to the Barbican here. And descend at various points. So there's a spiral ramp right at the bottom there going into All Saints Park. So if you can imagine that soffit actually carrying a walkway underneath it, which I think is why it was designed that way. And similarly, this is the first perspective produced by Peter Sainsbury and John Seward overnight. So Harold Wilson was coming to Manchester in 1967 to open Mancunian Way, which is our version of Hammersmith flyover. And he was making that presentation in the Rennell building, which had state-of-the-art rank projectors. But he also wanted a backdrop so that he could sort of further endorse this project for the National Computing Centre being in Manchester, obviously based on the fact that the first commercial computer had been produced in the city. So Sainsbury and Seward sat up all night working with one another to produce this perspective painting, and then the office had to work backwards from this painting to design the building. Now there's a couple of things that are kind of interesting about this. One is obviously this slightly kind of inverted ziggurat section, but also here, this cruciform plan. Now, what you can see is on the top right is the existing sort of Spartan grey box, then sort of enclosed by two wings, and then two further wings. And the majority of the ground floor accommodation there, other than the lecture theatre you can see at the bottom, is either circulation space or service space. So if you put those two things together, this kind of inverted ziggurat with this kind of cruciform plan that goes right to the edges of the site, but actually doesn't have that much accommodation, what you get is something that's kind of increasing its stature, but not increasing its kind of programmable area, on the basis that no one really knew what a national computing centre was for, or who would be working in it, how many people would be working in it, or really what they were going to be doing. And you can see here in this the existing building. The building itself, as it began to emerge in 1974, is at a similar scale to the BBC building that eventually came forward by BBC architects and not the BDP scheme. And then Mancunian Way here. And then this is a view looking back towards, this is the John Dalton building of what was Manchester Polytechnic. So you've got this kind of confluence here, really, of these kind of new technologies. So you've got the Polytechnic, which is teaching technical language and technology, the Computing Centre, which is advancing new programmes and working with businesses, and then the BBC North headquarters, and that's obviously sort of broadcasting here. So this kind of little technology quarter on Oxford Road. And then this is a building as complete with a great kind of hard landscaping plan by John Worley, who became Landscape Institute president and worked with Cruickshank and Seward quite a lot. So I'm going to go slightly backwards here to ICL, which were International Computers Limited at West Gorton. And this is an image of Pegasus computers being manufactured. And this is not, I've been speaking to Thaddeus a little bit today, this is not your IBM clean rooms that we saw in America. This is actually an old ironworks that became a textile factory that then was taken over by Ferranti to build computers. And Sebastian de Ferranti was very much of the opinion that if the government wanted computers from them, then the government would pay for the buildings, and until such a time as those contracts came forward, they would make do with what they had. And this kind of make do and mend mentality extended, to the architecture, but then also to the manufacture. So American computer manufacturers were outsourcing the making of various components and putting computers together, whereas because in Manchester you had this manufacturing and engineering tradition, Ferranti didn't think it was a proper undertaking unless they made everything. And so even in the late 2010s, when I went to visit this site, and Fujitsu became the eventual owners and moved out, there were engineering benches in the workshops left over. So everything was made on site. ICL grew from ICT, which itself grew from Ferranti, and you can see in this painting ICT as the logo at the top. Again, this is another Sainsbury painting, and this slide sort of shows how ICL emerged from these kind of early computer groups doing various things in Britain at various times. One group being in Manchester, who developed a particular form of storage. But the story of Baby being the very first computer in Manchester is a bit of Manchester exceptionalism that's not entirely true. Other things were happening at Cambridge and at Birkbeck. And so you see a revision. So this tower now has ICL on top of it rather than ICT, but another wonderful painting by Sainsbury, which I happen to own because a lovely man called Vic Stone, who was the security guard who showed me around the building, was the only person who'd been on the site long enough to remember it being built. He started there when he was 16, and as every company took over the building, he changed employer, so he stayed. And this was in a tank of drawings that nobody but Vic cared about, and he let me take it off site. And we're going to be exhibiting, I'm doing some work on Peter Sainsbury at the moment, we're going to be exhibiting some of his paintings in Manchester in July. And this was the building as constructed. Really strong kind of horizontal emphasis, which is a bit of a motif of Cruickshank Seward generally. So I was chatting with Kate and Nick before, and I think that Arthur Gibbon really was the better designer out of Gibbon and Seward in this post-war period. But there were certain moments where Seward and Gibbon, their styles became almost interchangeable and became the language of Cruickshank Seward in this period. So these very deliberate kind of forms on the roof, but also these strong horizontal emphases were sort of part of the visual language and the visual motifs of the practice in the period. Some rather wonderful landscaping again by John Worley. In the background, you can see a local authority block, and similarly here, some maisonettes. It's for you today. And what's interesting is that this is a new technology, the computer, growing up in a part of East Manchester where lots of old, heavy engineering had taken place. But you've also got these new post-war housing blocks sort of providing a new workforce. It's very much part of the kind of reinvention of the city. Still in manufacturing, but moving away from heavy engineering and obviously turning itself towards the service sector where most of Manchester's income comes from now. So really kind of pivotal site. And at one point, this was Europe's largest computer manufacturer. This was all demolished about 4 or 5 years ago without anybody making a noise about it. So this is some commercial work by Cruickshank Seward, again of the same period. Marketplace, which was one of a series of comprehensive development areas that came to characterise Manchester's post-war development. The first part of which came forward almost independently. This is Michael House from Marks and Spencer from 1961, again with this tower and podium configuration, and this rather wonderful kind of parabolic curved canopy, which, if anyone remembers the IRA bomb of 1996, this canopy remained intact despite the point of detonation being, I don't know if you can see the post box. This red post box here was where the van with all the explosives in it was parked. So the story goes, the reason they got to do this wonderful wavy canopy, because I suppose one of the things to remember about Manchester is that the price per square foot that you could let your buildings for was much, much less than it is in the capital. And so the amount of money you had to spend on your buildings was also significantly less. So often things like a wavy canopy was seen as frivolous. But in the office, they managed to work out that they could make it thinner by making it curvy. And so it used less concrete than a straight canopy. And so the curves prevailed and demonstrated their strength. It's about 100 mil thick. This is all now gone. But as I say, this was the first part of a much larger development called Marketplace, which involved the raising of the old Wellington and Sinclair's oyster bar by about 3 metres. They jacked them up on concrete stilts. This was the first time they were moved. They've been moved again subsequently nearer to the cathedral to create Manchester's medieval quarter, because you can make heritage, right? That's fine. And one of the reasons I suppose this came forward in this way is that the local authority in the 1960s, they didn't really have any money, but the planning department was revisiting the entirety of the city centre, and they dedicated certain areas as comprehensive development areas, which gave them the power to compulsory purchase, and it also gave them the opportunity to work with developers. And so this was Crown, the name of the developer escapes me, forgive me, a private property developer who only really wanted to do everything shy of the slab block at the top left there. But the local authority said, you know, we want you to develop everything, because otherwise we'll have this sliver of land. Behind that is the river, which will be left over. And so part of that was the reprogramming of all of the levels of the city and changing the medieval city. And you can see here in this sketch another Sainsbury. There's a link bridge there. So this is Deansgate in Manchester, and it's just starting to dip down towards the cathedral. And that link bridge there would sort of take you back to the middle of this development, the sort of square you can see there. Which by the sort of 1980s, so this is looking back to Marks and Spencer at the top, you can see the wavy canopy. But again, this very strong horizontal emphasis in the Cruickshank and Seward buildings, and then Wilson and Womersley's Arndale Centre behind. Unfortunately, these became quite forlorn spaces through the 1980s and really didn't age particularly well. And so in 1996, when that explosion happened, the opportunity was taken to demolish all of this and redevelop. Some other significant buildings that the practice undertook is its extension to Swinton Town Hall. Now, Swinton became the centre of Salford following local government reorganisation in 1974. So this became Salford's primary kind of council offices. They also did Arthur House in the city centre, a white commercial building. And then a series of buildings that are no longer with us, really quite funky. I don't know, I think Operational Garage was the name of the firm. I don't think it refers to a type of garage. But these really beautiful little sort of curved brick buttresses, and then this fantastic yellow space-framed roof propped up on these steel columns to give this big open interior. One building that they did get to spend a little bit of money on was this extension to Manchester's Bank of England, an office building at 82 King Street, again demolished a few years ago to make way for something taller, which didn't remember why this building had been built at this height originally, which was to preserve views of the town hall, which you can see the town hall tower, Waterhouse's building in the back of the image on the right there. Sadly, this building didn't survive either. So, as well as Arthur Gibbon and John Seward in the post-war period, there were two other partners, a guy called Ken Howarth, another chap called Lee Monks. Lee Monks died on site on a commercial development, the post office in Manchester in 1968. And Ken Howarth was a bit older and eventually retired. But I think it was, I think this was John Seward's building because it's quite curvy, and he was quite into his curved plans. But I think that this was by Ken Howarth, which is another school in Salford, with a sculpture by a chap called Alan Boyson. Now, this school was demolished to make way for some housing, but the final bay of it was saved with the artwork on, and it now has some barrack housing buttered hard up against it, but the artwork is still with us at least. And anyone who's seen the sorry state of William Mitchell's work elsewhere for the Lee Valley Water Company, where the same thing has happened. You've got these sort of terrible speculative housing with these wonderful mid-century artworks still sort of hanging on, but at least it's still with us. Elizabeth House, again, this sort of incredible horizontal emphasis, strong kind of oversailing roof, which is a motif of the practice all the way through. This was concrete, but it was originally intended to be in Portland stone, so it had a kind of resonance with Lutyens' cenotaph here, and also with E. Vincent Harris's Central Reference Library, which is just out of the shot behind us. And then this wonderfully detailed and sensitive building, an extension to the library at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, and this is Arthur's work again. And I think this was another connection with Bowden. So Bowden, before he was the principal at UMIST, before he worked for Ferranti, he was in Cambridge with Rutherford doing work on the atom and nuclear engineering. And I think that it was Bowden's connection with Cambridge that got Arthur this job at Emmanuel College. This has subsequently been re-extended and shrouded by something else in about 2007. And is a building I really wish I'd managed to capture before that happened, but alas, no. They did other work for Queen's Elms Hall in Belfast, and were noted. Queen's hadn't been, the architecture they'd been promoting up to this point hadn't been particularly well received, and they were noted as importing Manchester talent to do both this and the Ashby building that we saw earlier. The landscape here was by Brenda Colvin, a really important landscape architect of the post-war period. And I'm going to finish with a few projects that went unbuilt, but I think some of them, had they been realised, would have really changed the scale and the fate of the practice. I think it's fair to say I see Cruickshank Seward as Manchester's version of Ryder and Yates, or what Gillespie Kid Collier were in Glasgow, or Madin was to Birmingham, or Percy Thomas was to Cardiff. Most of these provincial cities had the kind of preeminent modern practice of the period. And I think that had some of these developments that I'm about to show you gone forward, then their status would have shifted from sort of regionally known practice to nationally acclaimed, if not internationally known. So this is a scheme that went unbuilt for Central Station in Manchester, which eventually became the GMEX Centre, which is one of the Greater Manchester Council's projects in the 1980s. The original station building was where trains used to arrive from Paddington, but fell victim to the Beeching Axe and was closed in 1968. Now, the local authority knew the closure was coming, but it was common knowledge as well. And so lots of people began to speculate on the station. And so the station was sold to an Irish company called Arkle Holdings. And I think this cork model in the top left was by another architect for Arkle Holdings, speculating on what they might do with the site. And that Cruickshank and Seward made a model of that as a sort of starting point for their own ideas. And this project was being directed by John Seward. In the bottom left here is an image from the local authority planning department. So the planning department was the first chief planner, John Miller, was given his post in 1963, and they set about this wholesale replanning of the city centre in the shadow of a 1945 plan, which was a brilliant piece of work by Roland Nicholas, the city engineer and surveyor. And so Central Station was another of the 6 comprehensive development areas designated by the planning authority. And they saw it coming forward as this sort of expo site and a kind of pleasure gardens. They were thinking about Copenhagen and the Tivoli Gardens at the time. So then this scheme up in the top right was Cruickshank and Seward's first stab at, I guess, a kind of response to this model, but also this, what they called an advisory plan, which came from the planning authority, which sort of said the type of development and the amount of development that they saw. And so through a series of models, and I guess drawings, but there aren't any drawings that survive, or certainly none that I've found, the team sort of set about thinking about what this might become. And so here in this model and this drawing again by Sainsbury, you can see the sort of pseudo retention of the original train hall, or a bit of it, alongside these 3 cylindrical towers, clearly influenced by BMW in Munich. And then onwards to a scheme that retained all of the train hall with a slab block and various versions that came forward. John Sheard, who was an architect who worked for John Seward, pointed out to me that the 2 cylindrical objects in the midground there are rolls of masking tape, obviously handily available in architects' offices in the period. And then here you get a sense of really the kind of opportunity available to the architects here. So they're also speculating about what development might go on beyond the site that they're charged with. And this, again, the landscape here is by John Worley. So looking at this big piece of water, there's actually a canal that passes underneath this site. So the idea was about opening up the canal to make some inner city parkland and the retention of the station hall. And then the scheme that received outline planning permission in 1974 was this. So this incredible mix of train shed exhibition centre, office accommodation, hotels, parkland. And actually, what is there now in terms of the type of accommodation and the area generally maps onto what was manifest here. Now, the reason it didn't go forward is because the funding for this scheme was wrapped up in a kind of post-colonial crisis, really. There's an organisation called the Crown Agents, who were a branch of the civil service that fell under the auspices of the Crown. And predominantly what they did during the colonial period was deal with supply chains, so sending things out to the colonies and bringing things back from the colonies. But they also had this very small property arm. So as countries began to become independent through the 1950s, the assumption was that the Crown Agents, their activities would just start to tail off and they would get smaller and smaller and smaller. But no one accounted for the survival instinct of these civil servants. And they saw this property arm as a really great opportunity to save their jobs. And so started developing it and investing more and more and more in this property arm. Now, if you were a developer and you saw money flowing out of the state, you wanted to get your hands on it. So these 2 enterprising individuals, Jack Walker and Ramon Green, saw this opportunity. And so you had mid-level civil servants with very little oversight giving millions of quids to private sector developers. Shortly after this, the whole thing collapsed and is known as the Crown Agent's Affair. And there were parliamentary inquiries where it was decided that nothing illegal had been done, but there was lots of bad management practice. And I mean, Green and Walker used to wonder why in depressed mid-1970s Manchester, they got people's backs up when they arrived in the city by helicopter. And one of them survives and is in the States, and I've never managed to get him to speak to me about what went on. But I think this scheme really, had it gone forward, would have been a real game changer for the practice and its scale and its stature. Similarly, quite funky, and clearly John Seward adopting his kind of gentle curves here. The Ringway Office Centre, which was never built, this would have been out near Manchester Airport, so between the Wythenshawe Estate and Ringway itself. And then a project for British Railways, who owned all of this land behind Piccadilly Station. The white sinuous curve you can see on the right-hand side is Richard Seafort's Gateway House, which was built. And then this incredible sequence of these sort of curved towers ascending in height with these wonderful sunken gardens, which obviously call to mind some of the other work that was going on in UMIST that never got built as well. And then to finish, this was a proposal for a new railway station in Tripoli in Libya that was done in the late 70s, early 80s. There was also a mosque that was part of this scheme, and a whole series of railway stations all the way up the coast in Libya. Now, Nick has told me this evening that his father had their mother cut all of the M&S labels out of his clothing before he went there because of their association with Israel. That wasn't the done thing. And John Sheard, who was an assistant to John Seward but worked with Arthur on this scheme, I interviewed him in 2012, 2013 in Torquay. Arthur's account in his sort of personal record of his career is that the oil money dried up, and so this never went forward, which I haven't been quite able to map onto the kind of peaks and troughs of the oil market. But John Sheard told me that this was actually, when you looked at the route of the railway and the proposed stations, that it was a sort of thinly veiled piece of military apparatus for Gaddafi's Libya. The practice continued, and Arthur did more work, most notably some laboratories for Siba Gaigi. And as he remarks in his own account of his own career, it's very much in the prairie style. So it's a brick building, and the first building that he made was the family home in Clatterbridge, which was also a brick building. And he recalls that one of his close friends who he'd studied with, who was also an architect, thinks that his career was sort of neatly bookended by these two brick buildings, but interspersed with this incredible flurry of white third wave modernism. Thank you.